We hear about global poverty all the time, but it's often in these really abstract terms. So, what does it actually look like on the ground? In this explainer, we're going to get past the headlines and really dig into the numbers, the causes, and the human stories that define extreme poverty in our world today. Okay, first, just look at this number over $118,000. So, what is that? Well, that's the economic output for just one person in Luxembourg, one of the wealthiest nations on the entire planet. Now look at this, $771. That is the exact same measurement for the exact same year, but for the nation of Burundi. Let that sink in for a second. That's not just a statistic, that's a 150 times difference. It represents this massive chasm in opportunity, in health, in just quality of life. This is the staggering scale of global inequality we're about to break down. So, the big question is, how do we even figure out which countries are the poorest? What are the actual metrics that groups like the World Bank and the IMF are using? Let's get into it. So the most common measurement, the one you hear about all the time, is gross domestic product, or GDP, per capita. It's a pretty straightforward way to get a quick snapshot of a country's economic health, right? It just looks at the average economic output for every single citizen. But as you can probably guess, it doesn't always paint the full picture. And that makes sense, right? A country's wealth, a person's well-being, it depends on so much more than just income. Exactly. That's why folks at the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, they knew they needed a more complete, a more human tool to really measure progress. And what they came up with is the Human Development Index, or HDI. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the HDI broadens that whole definition of development. It takes the money, the income metric, but it combines it with these absolutely crucial things like life expectancy and how many years of schooling people get. It gives us a much richer, way more complete picture of what life is actually like in a country. Okay, so keeping those metrics in mind, let's take a look at which countries are forecast to face the biggest economic hurdles. The data we're about to see is based on those GDP per capita projections, but for the year 2026. Before we even get to the specific countries, this one fact is just, wow, it is incredibly telling. The data shows this stark geographic focus of extreme poverty, with sub-Saharan Africa being the most affected region by a really long shot. So here are the top 8 countries from that forecast. What's worth noting is that the only non-African nations on this list are Afghanistan and Yemen, and both of them have been just shattered by years and years of conflict. The numbers here are they're tough to look at. A GDP per capita below $500, that's less than $2 a day per person. It's almost impossible to imagine, especially when you think about that number we started with. But, a list of numbers doesn't really tell the whole story, does it? The numbers tell us the what, but it's the stories of these nations that tell us the why. So let's zoom in on 3 specific case studies. First up, we're going to start with South Sudan. This is actually the world's youngest nation. It only gained independence back in 2011. But its short history, well, it's been defined by just immense hardship. This quote right here, it just perfectly captures the central paradox, the tragedy of South Sudan. See, the country is incredibly rich in oil, a resource that should be fueling its development. But instead, it's become what experts call the resource curse, where that wealth actually fuels conflict and corruption instead of prosperity. So what you have is this perfect storm of factors that have completely trapped the nation. A brutal civil war has been raging for most of its existence. The oil money has been totally squandered, and the violence has crippled the farms that most people depend on just to eat. The end result is a humanitarian crisis of devastating proportions. All right, next, let's turn our attention to Burundi. It's a small, landlocked nation in East Africa that, year after year, finds itself among the world's poorest countries. Now, Burundi's story is different. They don't have that oil wealth like South Sudan. Here you have the lingering scars from a really horrific civil war, and that's piled on top of a lack of natural resources. Something like 80% of the people there are subsistence farmers, which means they basically grow just enough food to feed their own families, and that's it. And with almost no one having access to electricity, the path to economic growth is incredibly steep. And finally, we have to look at Afghanistan. As we saw on that list, it is forecasted to be the world's single poorest country by GDP per capita in 2026.
Afghanistan is just a tragic example of how decades and decades of non-stop instability can systematically take a country's potential apart, piece by piece. Conflict has shattered its infrastructure, corruption has rotted its institutions, and its recent political isolation has just severed its vital connections to the rest of the world economy. So as you look at these three really different stories, South Sudan, Burundi, Afghanistan, you start to see these powerful common themes pop up. These are the factors that create these vicious cycles of poverty that are just unbelievably difficult to break.
So what are these common threads? Well, first, and we saw this in every single case, conflict and political instability are absolutely devastating. They make it impossible for any kind of real development to take hold. Second is that bizarre paradox, the resource curse we saw in South Sudan, where the wealth actually becomes a trap. And a third, and this is a growing factor, is climate vulnerability. For these countries, a single drought or a single flood can wipe out years of fragile progress in an instant. Okay, so if we zoom out from these individual countries, what does all this mean for the bigger picture, for global development as a whole? Well, a recent report from the UN suggests a pretty worrying trend. Just let that sink in. For the first time in more than 3 decades, global progress on human development is slowing down, and it's slowing down dramatically. The same report also found that the inequality gap between the richest and poorest nations, a gap that had been closing for years, is now getting wider again. And all of this leaves us with a critical and honestly a pretty urgent question. With global progress stalling and the gap between the haves and have-nots growing, you have to ask, what will it truly take from all of us to finally break these cycles and build a more fair and equitable future?